So our July topic is on policing reform. And you might ask, how does policing reform relate to the principles of humanism? And so, as you know, there's many different sets of humanism principles because we all think about things in slightly different ways. But I was just looking at the Paul Kurtz's list of affirmations of humanism. And I found two that I thought really relate well to the topic of policing reform. And one is, we are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and with eliminating discrimination and intolerance. And the second one I thought was applicable is, we attempt to transcend divisive parochial loyalties based on race, religion, gender, nationality, creed, class, sexual orientation, or ethnicity, and strive to work together for the common good of humanity. So I thought, topic of policing reform makes sense for a humanist meeting. So Law Enforcement Action Partnership, our speaker comes from this organization. How did we get connected with them? Well, in 2018, several of us attended Logical LA and heard a speaker from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership who gave a really excellent presentation on promoting using data and other countries' experience and other countries' successes, particularly to reform US drug policy in a way that gives better outcomes and at lower cost. And I jotted down that information for my future list of future speakers I'd like to share with this group. So when we had an opening come up in July, I went through my list and I said, ooh, we haven't talked with these people yet, and contacted them, and they said they'd be happy to provide us a speaker on this topic. And then just after that, the demonstrations began. So our timing was really perfect because now there's a lot of people all over the place, all over the world talking about policing reform. And, you know, we hit it just right. So our speaker today, Terry, there's Terry in his office, Terry dressed up, suit and tie version, COVID version of Terry. So what is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership? I'm sure he'll tell you more about it, but I really liked what I read about the mission: to unite and mobilize the voice of law enforcement in support of drug policy and criminal justice reforms that will make communities safer by focusing law enforcement resources on the greatest threats to public safety, by promoting alternatives to arrest and incarceration, by addressing the root causes of crime, and working towards healing police-community relations. The vision about, they envision a world in which criminal justice and drug policies keep our communities safer, and we're ending the war on drugs, looking beyond the criminal justice system for a range of solutions to address society's ills, will better protect human rights, reduce violence, reduce addiction, and build public respect and trust in law enforcement. And our speaker, Terry, is a retired sergeant with the Gila County Sheriff's Office in Arizona. He told me he's a former homicide detective and an expert and advocate in policing reform. He also shared with me, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, that he's not only the son of Christian missionaries, but he's also experienced, you know, being a Christian, at some point in his life being an atheist, at some point in his life being an agnostic. So what I thought that what both of these indicate is Terry is an individual who can relate across some of the big divides in life, both in terms of his work, his advocacy, and his personal experiences. So with that, Terry, I'll turn it over to you and share your presentation. So what do you guys see now on sharing? Do you see policing reform or a blank screen?
Okay, can you hear me?
Policing
So
reform.
Perfect.
the problem is, here's the problem. You're not doing full screen. You're in edit mode.
Can you see it? All right.
Yeah, but I don't think you understand.
I
So
do
it's as if
understand, but I'm saying, isn't it good enough? Are you okay
that's
there?
now that's the way it should be.
Okay. All right. Terry, it's up to you.
Right.
Over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Judy, for that introduction. I am very pleased to be here and honored that these issues are important to you and you're taking the time to, to talk to me and to hear what LEAP has to say. I really did enjoy the principles of humanism that you read. I relate to those completely. I'm perfectly fine with you, explaining what my background is. And it really, I've been very fortunate in my life to be exposed to a lot of different ways of thinking. I've been very, very curious, even from when I was a young man. I made my father, who is a Bible scholar, I made him a little crazy at times with my questions and my doubts. And, I read voracious reader. I read, everything I could get a hold of when I was a young man, including St. Thomas Aquinas and, other philosophers and biblical, books, commentary. And so, yes, I've been really, really fortunate to be able to expose. And I would describe myself right now basically as, you know, an agnostic. That's probably the closest, to what I actually believe. And I do think that everything that is going on right now and everything that we're discussing and a lot of the issues that we work on do have to do with, with justice and fairness and with, uh, basically caring about our fellow humans and about our society and really wanting to try to make a difference. All of the work that I do with Law Enforcement Action Partnership is all volunteer. I am an executive board member. I've been with the organization for about 4 years, and every opportunity I get, I speak, I do press interviews. I recently was interviewed for a documentary series that'll be coming out soon on the drug war. And so I believe that all of us really should be doing everything that we can to try to, to further the discussion around these topics. You did a great job of, somebody asked me, what country did you grow up in? Well, I grew up in Mexico and Central America. My parents were Pentecostal missionaries, which is an evangelical organization. And we moved to Arizona when I was in my mid-teens, and ultimately that's where I ended up becoming a police officer. But just to tell you, the description that you read of LEAP, or Law Enforcement Action Partnership, is really great. It sounds a little generic, and you might have difficulty being able to tell really what our true agenda is and what we work on, what we care about the most based on that that description. And I will tell you that the description that I give, the one sentence description that I give everyone is that LEAP is a national organization made up of police officers, prosecutors, and judges who advocate for drug policy reform, policing reform, criminal justice reform, and other issues relating to the criminal justice system. And my sort of off-script description of it is that it's an organization made up of people working in those particular professions who now get it. Excuse the air quotes, but when you're in law enforcement, a lot of times it's difficult to see the big picture. And unfortunately, it's at times when you're in that, you're surrounded by other people who are thinking the same way. Most of your friends are cops. And so at times it's a little difficult to sort of consider other points of view. And so one of the things that we do in law enforcement is we're trying to present options for members of the law enforcement community to consider other ways of thinking and other solutions other than what has traditionally been sort of this very specific toe the law enforcement line that we've had in this country. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about me. I described a little bit. If you would like to move to the next slide. See if you can advance to the next slide. So that's me right in the middle there. That's me making an arrest. The organization LEAP is made up of a lot of different individuals from different types of law enforcement. Like I said, we even have prosecutors and judges, and we're very fortunate to have a very diverse group of individuals. Super, we have people on our board and on our staff, and our group of speakers, really smart people that now are just asking for a little bit of balance in this whole conversation. So if you can advance to the next slide. So I told you a little bit about me. When I was grew up in Arizona, I became, at the age of 21, I went to work for the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Some of you may have heard of it. That's where Sheriff Joe was sheriff for many, many terms. I worked in the jail for a year, and then I was able to get out on the road. I became a patrol deputy, and I worked as a patrol deputy. I worked as a regular detective. I was able to work on homicides. I ended up leaving the sheriff's office in order to do some work in Latin America. I've always had a love and a passion for Latin America, and I went back to Latin America. I worked in security. I was a bodyguard and doing other security type things throughout Latin America. I ended up working for the Department of State. I've worked throughout the world for the Department of State doing different things. I worked in Afghanistan, I've worked in Iraq, I've worked throughout Latin America for the Department of State. I did a stint with the Department of Defense. And I went back to law enforcement in Gila County, which is in Arizona. And pretty much that's where I finished my local law enforcement career, at least. Ended up going abroad again, living throughout the world, doing security, counterterrorism related things for the U.S. government. A lot of what I did throughout Latin America was working on training police officers. Because I speak Spanish fluently and I speak Portuguese, I did a lot of training and mentoring of police officers and military personnel throughout Latin America. A lot of it, what I did was had to do with the war on drugs. We were, most of the money that the U.S. government spends in Latin America is based on that has to do with training and mentoring of police and basically standing up law enforcement officials, has to do with grants and money that is funding that comes in order to fight drugs and to counter drugs. I got out of government work altogether. I ended up working, I was senior director of corporate security for a gold mining conglomerate, one of the largest 5 gold mining companies in the world. Again, mostly traveling throughout Latin America and, you know, working, I had purview over the storage and movement of 1 billion with a B, $1 billion of gold per year. It was a really great experience. After that, I've worked several different security jobs, but I did have a really great opportunity to be head of security for Beats. Apple a few years ago bought the company Beats, and which is a headphone and music company, and they put me in charge of the security for that company. Had a lot to do with executive protection. I oversaw the protection of Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine and other celebrities that were affiliated with Beats, including Lady Gaga and others. It was a really incredible opportunity as well. In 2006, I was working with Apple in 2016 when the voters in California decided to legalize marijuana for adult use. And at that time, prior to that, I had started to really consider, you know, the viability of cannabis and really trying to look at what I had been taught in the past about cannabis and its medicinal properties and whether my government had lied to me about it or not. And regardless of whether you're pro-marijuana or anti-marijuana, it's really difficult to disagree with the fact that our government had lied to us at the very least when they told us that it should be a Schedule I narcotic because there was no medicinal value to it whatsoever. So I really started to examine that, and then I ended up, you know, really starting to work with drug policy reform in general. I realized that the war on drugs wasn't working, and that there were a lot of casualties because of that. Had spent billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. And actually, I saw a figure with an estimate from one expert who said that when you really look at everything that we've done throughout the world, the U.S. has done throughout the world, the figure is closer to $1 trillion that we have spent in the war on drugs, and we're not any closer today to having any sort of success than we were when we started that journey a long time ago. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide, Judy, if you'd like. So to move on to the topic that we're here to talk about today, as I'm sure all of you know, there's been a lot of press, a lot of activity, a lot of news surrounding the death of George Floyd. And I'm sure that I probably don't have to tell you, but just to recap quickly, George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020. Officer Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for a little under 8 minutes while Floyd was handcuffed and lying face down, repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." A little bit over 2 minutes, the last little over 2 minutes of that, he wasn't moving or speaking. He was not responsive, and Officer Chauvin continued to kneel on his neck until he died. We know that other officers assisted with the holding down of Floyd and did not stop Chauvin from kneeling on Floyd's neck. When I saw the video, I was astounded. I had trouble understanding why it happened. And I dove in and I read everything that I could read. I watched all the video that I could find. And my analysis was that the attitudes and the actions or inactions of the other police officers at that scene made me believe that there must be a culture of acceptance within the Minneapolis Police Department of uh, those those sort of attitudes, that sort of action or inaction. And just based on my own experience in law enforcement, I know that that you know you really only, it's very rare that police officers just break out of the pattern and practice of their fellow, the culture within the culture of their department, and just do things that are completely out of character. Most of the time, if you do something, it's because you know that it's going to be accepted by your colleagues, especially if they're right there next to you, shoulder to shoulder. So everything that I saw really led me to believe that the culture of the Minneapolis Police Department really fostered that sort of behavior, and also the silence that we saw from the other officers. If you would like to go ahead and advance the slide.
Yeah, that's the next one. You have it.
Oh, okay. So, uh, like I said, the George Floyd killing was a really pivotal moment, but there also had been other deaths of African Americans, people of color, during the last few months and even over the last few years that have really raised a lot of questions. And when that happened, when George Floyd was killed, obviously there were protests that happened nationwide, and those protests, a lot of them erupted into violence and looting, and a lot of people were injured or killed. There was cell phone camera footage that showed officers engaged in what many believed to be excessive use of force, plowing of a police car into a crowd, pushing an older man to the ground who was injured, a young woman being pushed. And I believe that those images on television really caused the violence to increase and to be even worse than it might have been otherwise. Not blaming the media or anything, but I'm just saying that that some of the things that police officers did during that time may have added to the violence. These clashes between the police and the demonstrators resulted in hundreds of injuries on both sides. We subsequently had a national outcry for equity and equality and against racism in general, but specifically it was because of the outcry against what people saw as police brutality and police abuse of power. And so there was a national outcry for policing reform. And there was a national movement also counter to that. A lot of people came out in support of the police and were defending the police and opposed to what they saw as radical sort of actions that were being suggested and requested against the police. You can go ahead and advance if you'd like. So I will tell you my own personal experience, and when I'm speaking for LEAP, I try to be careful to explain what my own personal experiences and opinions are, because although I agree with most of what LEAP espouses, from time to time there are minor things that opinions that I might have that LEAP either doesn't have as part of its uh, sort of beliefs or mission statement, or there are minor things that I don't may not agree with the LEAP platform. Uh, so just to tell you about my experience in law enforcement, most law enforcement officers in general have good intentions and they want to do the right thing. I would say the vast majority of police officers. Most police agencies have a reasonably good culture and they really try to hold officers accountable. They do it to avoid lawsuits, they do it to avoid bad press, and they also do it because it's the right thing. A lot of them do. And it doesn't mean that we don't have outliers, because we do. Most police agencies have excellent training. We started seeing a couple of decades ago, we started seeing sensitivity training that was being given by police departments, some police departments, to their officers. This sensitivity training encourages more progressive attitudes, a more accepting attitude of different races and cultures and genders, and also one of the big issues has been with the LGBTQ community. Law enforcement attitudes towards that. Unfortunately, I remember when I was in law enforcement and there was a big push to give sensitivity training to the officers. The officers, most officers, well, almost all officers were resistant to this training. They really didn't like it. They said it was ridiculous. I can't repeat here, uh, uh, among this crowd, some of the expletives that were used to describe this training. And in general, it just didn't seem to be effective because either the way that it was presented or just the fact that the police really didn't want to hear it. They just felt that it was ridiculous and that they didn't need to be taught to be sensitive, that they had a job that was much harder than that, and that the people who were forcing us to do this training didn't understand the nature of what we do as police officers. Most officers that I have known are not racists. You have to remember that I only worked for, several different agencies. I very rarely saw officers behave towards member of the public in what I would call a racist way. At the time, we were fairly well integrated. We had people of color who were police officers. We had genders. At the time, it was very taboo to admit that you weren't what might be called straight. If you were either gay or lesbian or anything else, you just didn't talk about that. And if you were asked, most of the time you would deny it, because it was just so taboo that if you did openly admit anything like that, you just would not be accepted. Now, fortunately, California has been more progressive than that. I remember back when I was in law enforcement over a decade ago, we as cops, we used to make fun of California police and, the way that they were so accepting of, people that, with different gender preferences and that sort of thing. So I can tell you that in general, law enforcement has been very unwilling to accept any type of just open acceptance of diversity, especially when it came to, LGBTQ members. It has been really, really difficult for law enforcement to get law enforcement to be accepting, openly accepting, and it's still taboo. My understanding is that most departments around the U.S., if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, you will not openly discuss that, and you would even deny it if you were asked, because you would be ostracized and made fun of by the other officers. In general, what I have found is that police officers are very resistant to change. They like the status quo. They like things to be the way that they are. They just don't want anything different. And if anything, they want things to go back to the way that they were. I remember when I was a young officer and I was being trained by older officers, they told me, I remember them saying, "Oh, it's ridiculous now. We arrest somebody and they're out the door in a few hours before we even get a chance to finish our reports. They're pushing us to accept, gays or lesbians. They're pushing us to hire more females. They're pushing us to hire more blacks or, other races. It's just law enforcement has gone to hell in a handbasket. And it's just, I can't wait to retire. I don't envy you having to spend, 20 plus years in law enforcement because, the likelihood that, that law enforcement is going to look anything like it does now or like it should look is pretty slim." So in general, law enforcement officers have taken that attitude. Again, that is a generalization. So even though I haven't seen a lot of racism directly by police officers, most police officers in general try to be fair with people of different races and cultures, outwardly fair with them. We have seen what we believe is systemic racism or implicit bias within law enforcement. And I won't get too in the weeds with that, but I will tell you that one of the very interesting statistics that I heard several years ago, and is still true, is that in the United States, when this particular these numbers were investigated, young black males use marijuana at about the same rate as young white males. In some areas, young white males use it at an even higher rate than young black males. But what we find is that, and this varies, but we find that young black males are arrested 3 to 4 times more often than young white males. And of course, people will have different explanations for that. They'll have different reasons. But the reality is that no matter how you look at it, there is something wrong with a system or with a society where that happens. And so what those of us in law enforcement and also people who are studying law enforcement, fortunately, we have a lot of really smart people, college investigators, university investigators, and government officials who are interested in trying to understand this implicit bias and profiling and that sort of thing. They've done a lot of really fascinating studies. As a matter of fact, Oakland Police Department is really at the epicenter of that. Berkeley has done a lot of investigating and just looking, really trying to understand, spending thousands of hours going over contacts between police and the public, trying to understand why there seems to be a much higher arrest rate for, for people of color, and why people of color are feeling unsafe in our society. Judy, can you remind me how much time I have left?
Let's see. You have, you can go 20 to 30 more minutes.
Okay, great.
And then we'll have time for questions.
Great. So if you don't mind advancing to the next slide.
All right. You have it.
Great. I left law enforcement in 2009. The last few years that I worked in law enforcement, I was asked to be in charge of internal affairs investigations for my agency. And I really didn't want to do it because it's not a good job to have. The officers don't really like the people who do conduct the IA investigations, and I didn't want to be that guy, that person. But what I saw was that the other individuals that they had considered for this role, I just wasn't sure that they would really do it in a fair way. I wanted it to be fair for the officers, because I'm very proud of a lot of the men and women that I've worked with. I know that it's a hard job, and I know that it's complicated, it's nuanced, and I felt that they needed to be treated fairly. I also saw a lot of nepotism. I saw officers persecuted because they weren't part of the insiders. They didn't play on the baseball team, or they didn't golf with the chief or with the sheriff. And I really wanted it to be fair from that perspective, but I also wanted it to be fair to the public, because I've been a little bit of a student of history. I am familiar with racial unrest. I actually happened to be in Los Angeles during the riots in the early 90s. And I've tried to understand what causes racial unrest. And I had studied, there was some some congressional work done on racial unrest in the United States in the late 60s. And they looked at the racial disparities. And so I've really been a student of that over the decades, and really fascinated with this racial unrest, and curious about what the reasons were. And so when I was appointed to this position, to do internal affairs investigations, I really dove in, like I've tried to do with other things in my life. I really dove in and tried to understand the complexities of internal affairs investigations, and tried to understand what the national standards were. I've been taught and have learned that generally, if I'm trying to do something, I'm not the first person who tried to do that. And that there were probably very smart, capable people who have done this work before I did it, and probably have good ideas. And I generally believe that our federal government, for the most part, puts time and effort into trying to create guidelines and standards and laws for different things that we try to do. And most of the time, those are relatively fair and make sense. So I was very fortunate to be able to go to a couple of conventions, a couple of national training courses of internal affairs officers, and speak to IA investigators from other agencies throughout the US, in particular throughout the West. And I've just always had a lot of friends in law enforcement. So I had a pretty good idea of what was going on with IA investigations and with the complaint process. And when I talk about the complaint process, I'm talking about the process whereby a citizen who feels that they have been offended or mistreated by the police have an opportunity to file a complaint against that particular police officer or against the agency, and to seek some sort of relief because of something that occurred to them. My agency at the time, although it was a good agency, and again, a lot of really great men and women working there who care about their community, I found that they had very limited guidelines for conducting internal affairs investigations. And I found that to be true for many agencies in the US. And I was really surprised by that. So what I did was I tried to look to see if the federal government had guidelines, because the in law enforcement, the federal government, for example, most of our state laws in most states within the United States have been based on a set of recommendations for laws that was put out by the federal government. And there are other things that the guidelines that the federal government has put out that we generally follow. So I was able to find that, and again, this is the mid to late 2000s. I found that the Department of Justice in 2005 had put out a set of guidelines for conducting, for accepting complaints and for conducting internal affairs investigations. I read it, devoured it, was really fascinated by it, and thought that it would be a good idea to use it as a guideline for our policies at my agency. Unfortunately, the leadership at my agency didn't like that idea. They said that we had our own guidelines, that the federal government, that was those were designed for agencies that had problems, law enforcement agencies that had problems with officers who were rogue and who had problems with corruption, and that those guidelines really didn't apply to us. I didn't understand it. I didn't agree with it, but obviously, law enforcement is a hierarchical type model, and I had to do what I was told. I also did investigations online about police complaints in general, police corruption. I read books on police corruption, and I found a lot of stories in the media that highlighted law enforcement corruption, law enforcement abuse, police brutality. And in particular, I was able to find some videos online, some news stories. They were exposés, they were investigations, kind of like, I believe one of them was actually 2020. There were a couple of other national news organizations that did these. What they did was they took individuals, put them undercover. Some of them were reporters and some of them were just volunteers. They mic'd them up and videotaped them with you know, Zoom lenses, and they sent them into police departments throughout the country to try to file complaints. And I have to tell you that out of all of the things that I have been exposed to, the things that I have seen that I would consider transformational in my belief about these particular issues and about law enforcement and our willingness to serve the public, these particular stories were transformational for me. I saw that again and again, police departments refused, some of them refused to take complaints. Others would do it begrudgingly and, sort of, throw it in the trash after the person filed the complaint. Others were, they would intimidate the person who was trying to file a complaint. They would intimidate them into not filing the complaint. They would argue with them. And there were even some of these undercover people who were arrested for insisting that they wanted to file a complaint against the police. I knew that my particular agency, when I suggested at my agency, I suggested that we implement a more organized and transparent complaint process that would allow, that would accept any complaint. And you would think that a law enforcement agency, that if someone wanted to file a complaint, that it would be a very simple process, right? I call the police department, or I show up at the front desk and I say, I would like to file a complaint against an officer or officers or against this particular department. You would think that they would be given a form, they would be given an opportunity. Maybe there would even be an opportunity to do that online. And I can tell you that that is absolutely not the case. My particular agency, what they had in place was that the on-duty supervisor, if someone called the agency or showed up at the front desk and wanted to file a complaint against an officer, the on-duty supervisor would speak to that person and would determine whether or not that was a legitimate complaint or not, and would make the decision themselves as to whether or not they were going to even give the person a witness statement to fill out. There wasn't even an actual form that you could fill out that was called a citizen complaint form. It was just a witness statement, which was sort of the same thing that we gave other people, out in the field that had witnessed a crime or some sort of incident, an accident, an auto accident. And I didn't understand this. I said, it seems intuitive to me that we should be able to, give any member of the public who wants to file a complaint, give them a form, have them fill it out. At least we document it and we look into it. And yes, maybe it's frivolous, maybe it's not, but at least we have documented the fact. We have given that person an opportunity to make their complaint. And so we can decide from there whether or not it needs to be investigated further, or exactly what action needs to be taken. So when I suggested this to my particular agency, the leadership at my agency said, you don't want to do that. You're opening a can of worms. If you start just accepting any complaint that anybody wants to file, you will get flooded with complaints, frivolous complaints. And what will happen is most of them will be unfounded, frivolous, and it'll be an opportunity for people to try to get revenge against police officers. And there will be a record on file that someone filed a complaint against an officer, when in reality, all that officer was probably doing was they were doing their job. They did nothing wrong, and this person is just unhappy. we work inherently in a profession where people do not like what we do, even if it's anywhere from giving someone a ticket to arresting someone. The members of the public do not understand the complexities of what we do. And so their ability to complain should be screened and should be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Well, I can tell you from experience that in my particular agency, it depended on which supervisor was on duty at the time. There were some supervisors that absolutely did not accept any complaints whatsoever. If you were a member of the public, it didn't matter what happened to you. If you spoke to that supervisor, they would basically tell you, well, I'll check it out and I'll let you know. You would either never get a phone call back or any contact, or sometimes they would call you back and say, yeah, I looked into it and it's really not what you say it is. And if you persist in filing this complaint, then we will charge you with false reporting to a police officer, which is a crime. Very seldom, occasionally you would get supervisors who would actually accept the complaint and actually handle it in what I would consider a professional way. And this was an agency that was relatively free of corruption. You have to understand that this was an agency that I was pretty proud of for the most part. If someone did something wrong and it was discovered, most of the time they would take some sort of action on it. But the fact that they didn't even have a formal complaint system was really disturbing to me. And the more I looked into this process at other agencies, I found that this was really, really rampant. So I was really disturbed by this. If you would like to go ahead and move to the next slide, Judy.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. So as I started to have this awakening and this understanding of the situation, and also being a student of history, I started to raise my voice at the time and say, something is wrong here. We are not really providing the level of service and the sort of opportunity for the community to respond, the community to give feedback as to how they felt their law enforcement agency was doing, especially people in groups of minorities, peoples that weren't, and groups that weren't widely represented or that didn't have a lot of power, and in particular people of color. At the time, I was really concerned that we were setting ourselves up for some serious problems. And at the time, in my agency and even in my region, in other agencies, nobody wanted to hear this. And this quote was published in a magazine article recently, a news article where I was interviewed. And these were pretty much almost exactly my words. I said that I feel like there's going to be a day of reckoning. I felt that there was a great possibility that someday we would have widespread rioting and looting, and maybe even a revolution unless we did something about being able to give a voice to these communities that really didn't feel like law enforcement was serving them, and that they had no recourse whatsoever against anything that police did against members of their community. I did some research at the time, and there were some officers, mostly former officers, who had written some articles and were basically saying similar things, but it was very, very rare. And when I started saying these things in my police agency at the time, I can tell you that I did not get a good response. They didn't want to hear it. They told me that I was, turning into a liberal, that I was becoming a softie, that I was going over to the dark side. and that that I just basically had allowed myself to be my thinking to be perverted by all of the reading that I had done, and I was working on my university degrees at the time as well. So a lot of them said, "Oh, you know, you've allowed yourself to be sucked in by the academia, by super liberal, uh, you know, professors and others in you know in our higher educational system, and you shouldn't allow yourself to be, you know, convinced of these things." If you'd like to go ahead and move to the next slide.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. There are some things that we need to consider when we're talking about policing reform. One of the figures that most people are astounded by, that they really didn't know was the case, there are currently over 18,000 police agencies in the United States. And those vary. They range from police agencies with 2 or 3 officers to larger agencies that have tens of thousands. And while the guidelines exist that I told you about that were put out in 2005, also President Obama had a task force that came out with a set of guidelines and recommendations for police accountability. For the most part, each agency pretty much decides what they want to do. Like I told you before, I found that a lot of agencies didn't even have an internal affairs policy. A lot of the smaller agencies, especially in rural areas, if a police officer does something to you and you call the agency or show up at their front desk, they just wing it. They basically just decide how they're going to handle it. They don't have any guidelines. Whoever happens to be on duty at the time, especially the supervisor, would decide how to handle that. And if they think that you're trying to file a frivolous complaint, or if they're friends with the officer that you're complaining about, it won't go anywhere, and you have no recourse whatsoever. So consequently, the response of police agencies nationwide is almost as different as the number of agencies there are. And for sure, it really varies greatly on the culture of that particular department. There is some accountability that exists depending on the governmental agency that oversees that particular police department or sheriff's office. For example, the Los Angeles Police Department, they come under the purview of the Los Angeles City Council. Their day-to-day operations and the way that they handle things really depends mostly on the police leadership. The city council doesn't have a lot of say in what they do day to day. They have the ability to take their funding away, and they do have some power because the police chief is appointed by the city council. So the city council has more power. But when you have a sheriff's office where the the leader of that particular agency is elected, that sheriff has almost ultimate power as to how they want to run that agency. And the only recourse that the Board of Supervisors has is by threatening to withhold funding or not to give them additional funding that they are seeking. And if the sheriff has a lot of power, and I'll use Sheriff Arpaio as an example. Sheriff Arpaio in Maricopa County had a lot Maricopa County, Arizona, had a lot of power. He was widely supported by the public, especially members of the public that were influential, had money. There were a lot of retirees in Maricopa County, and they were very supportive of Arpaio. He's a law and order sheriff. They loved that. And he pretty much could do anything he wanted. There were even accusations that he had a team of detectives who went out and gathered dirt on the members of the Board of Supervisors and was using that to blackmail them so that they would not vote against him for anything that he wanted to do. And there's some evidence to that. I actually have a little bit of insider knowledge on that I can't really talk about, but I can tell you that there were some really bad things going on during that administration. So when we look at the number of agencies, police agencies in the United States, it's really astounding that no other country in the world comes close to the U.S. In having 18,000 police agencies. Canada is actually the closest to that. Canada has, I think, a little over 50 police agencies nationwide. And granted, they're much smaller, but if you think about the fact that they're much smaller and they only have over 50, and there are no other countries globally that have anywhere near even the 50 police agencies that Canada has, it makes you realize that we have a very unique system, a very decentralized system of law enforcement with very little centralized control or federal control. All of these agencies pretty much do whatever they want with very little oversight. The only time that you see some oversight is when there is systemic violations of human rights, and the Department of Justice is able to obtain a court order removing that particular police agency's individual autonomy and allowing the Department of Justice to go in and basically reform that police department. But that's very, very rare. There are very few federal judges that are willing to override local control. And of course, we know that in the United States of America, local control is big. Not only state control, state autonomy, but also local autonomy. So it's very rare that you're going to find a federal judge that is going to give the Department of Justice the right to go in and basically own that police department for a period of time. Oakland Police Department is a perfect example of that. Oakland Police Department had a history of systemic human rights abuses, and the Obama administration, the Department of Justice was able to get a court order to go in, and they are still under that. The Oakland Police Department is still under that order, and they have made a lot of changes and a lot of improvements because they were forced to, and eventually they just got into the swing of things and said, "Fine, we're gonna comply with these, and we're gonna." I know some Oakland police commanders, and I can tell you that most of them think that it has been a good thing. In the beginning, it wasn't that way. In the beginning, they just hated it. They said, "This is ridiculous." They fought it. There were a lot of court battles. They didn't want to comply with any of these federal standards. So that's on rare occasion where the federal government gets involved at the local level. Most people have no idea of that. Most people think that there is more federal oversight. If you'd like to move to the next slide.
Okay, you got it.
So LEAP, although we've been working on policing reform for a while, after the national outcry for policing reform, we came up with a set of recommendations. We we published a letter. I signed on. I actually helped formulate the letter, and then signed on to it as well, and have had the amazing opportunity to be able to speak widely about this letter and these recommendations. We are asking for, first of all, transparency. We believe that Congress should establish an independent national public database recording all officers who were terminated or resigned due to misconduct, including but not limited to excessive use of force, corruption, domestic violence, assault and harassment, perjury, falsifying a police report, and planting or destroying evidence. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Seems intuitive that we should have something like that. Well, we don't, and we never have. These officers should be prohibited by law from being certified as a police officer ever again in any state. And just so that you understand the way this works, even though there are a lot of local police departments, in all states of the union, there is a state agency that licenses police officers. They don't always have a lot of power, but they do actually issue certification for police officers to be able to function as a police officer in that state. Here in California, we have what we call POST, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training. We believe that Congress should require law enforcement agencies to track complaints and disciplinary actions against officers and share this information with other agencies in the hiring process. Again, to go back to what I talked about before, how that most agencies don't have a complaint process, and if they do, most of them don't adhere to that. Congress should require agencies to collect and report information on police stops and uses of force with data disaggregated by race and other demographic categories. Again, this is in an effort to try to figure out why there are communities that feel disconnected, why there are communities that feel underserved by law enforcement, and at times are even afraid of law enforcement. They feel like they're being harassed or they're being singled out. And regardless of your political leanings on that particular issue, we really need to understand better what's going on there. And so agencies are not required to participate in that. They do it voluntarily. The only ones that are required are the very few number of agencies that are under consent decrees from the Department of Justice, the way that I was explaining to you earlier that Oakland is. If you'd like to move to the next slide.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. We believe that there should be accountability. Congress should establish a national standard for the use of deadly force that upholds the sanctity of life, that raises the threshold for the use of deadly force above the one found in Graham versus Connor. The decision set a floor, not a ceiling. We can better protect lives by ensuring that unreasonable force is not sanctioned by law. And again, that varies from state to state. I remember when I became a police officer in Arizona, back in the 80s, they said, well, our state law says that you can shoot a felon in the back when they're running from you. But there have been recent and not so recent Supreme Court decisions, particular Tennessee versus Garner was the one that really governed a lot of the way that we did things, that said that you can't shoot a felon in the back just for fleeing from you. And there was a time when you could, and you would get away with it. And in some states, you can still get away with it. But the Supreme Court said that the only time that you can shoot a person who is fleeing from you is if you believe that there's a likelihood that they are going to, they are a danger to the public, and that you are preventing someone's death or serious physical injury by shooting that person as they're running away. We believe that accountability affirmatively states an officer's duty to employ de-escalation techniques and to intervene when another officer is using excessive force. prohibits all maneuvers that restrict the flow of blood or oxygen to the brain, such as neck compression and chokeholds without justification for lethal force. Requires deadly physical force investigations to be conducted by independent prosecutors, such as state attorneys general, rather than local prosecutors. Next slide, please.
Okay.
In general, we believe that qualified immunity should be looked at again. Qualified immunity is the doctrine that grants government officials immunity from civil suits unless the plaintiff shows that the official violated clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. Makes it really, really difficult to file a lawsuit against police officers. And that we believe Congress should pass a law. So that concludes, if you could move to the next slide, please. That basically concludes the portion of the presentation that has to do with our position on, and my own personal position on policing reform. I'm happy to answer some questions. If you don't mind, first, I would just like to make a few suggestions to you. If you're interested in this topic and you like what we're doing or don't agree with what we're doing, we're always open to, discussion about these particular issues. We ask that you don't just need to be a member of law enforcement in order to be a member. We welcome members. Anybody who wants to become a member can become a member of LEAP. There is a requirement of a small donation, and we function solely off of donations. We do have expenses, even though most of the speakers and the board members work on a volunteer basis. A lot of our staff, they have to be paid, and we have a lot of things that cost money, and we try to we need to fund those with donations. So we just ask that people consider that. Please go to the LEAP website. You'll see more there. We ask for volunteers, especially people who are former law enforcement, or even have any sort of connection with law enforcement, or prosecution teams, judges, anybody that was involved in the criminal justice system. We would like to speak to them about possibly becoming speakers, because we just feel like that as many voices as we can get out there who are talking about these issues, we really welcome that. Recommend new presentation venues. If you have other organizations that you belong to, or media outlets that would like to speak to me or to us in general, we love to be able to get the word out, and that's really how we do it, is by speaking to as many people as we can. And just tell your friends and relatives that law enforcement officers believe that supervised injection facilities, I missed that quote there. Just in general, tell them that there are police officers out there, and former police officers and prosecutors and judges, who now advocate for policing reform. And so we would just ask that if you know any police officers, mention to them, ask them to go to our website. And if they want to talk to me personally, I am super accessible. You can find me on LinkedIn. I get contacted all the time from people who have read articles, listened to podcasts, radio shows that I did, and I'm more than happy to talk to people. There's a blog on our website called Just Solutions, and it's the official blog of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, featuring expert law enforcement commentary on the most pressing issues. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter page, we have Instagram, and please, in particular, most people are on Facebook. Go to our Facebook page, like it, follow it, and you'll be able to see a lot of the things that we're doing on this particular front. Here is my email address. Feel free to email me. Again, I'm super accessible. Like I said, you can also find me on LinkedIn. I try to answer every LinkedIn message that I get, really trying to mentor as many people as I can, especially people in the criminal justice system who are interested in these particular issues. If they're currently serving, I especially love that, because I feel like we really need to have an impact on people that are currently serving to try to help them understand these issues and what they can do, because it generally in this country, prior to just recently, most people support the police and most people believe what the police say. So if the police are saying that we don't need reform, unfortunately, we won't see reform. So although I feel that there has been a little bit of an overreaction lately, some calls to abolish the police and that sort of thing, I think are extreme. I do believe that there needs to be more movement towards reform, and a lot of the things that I talked about today are things that we can that we can do to move in that direction. I know that I'm going to answer some questions. So what I'll do is I'll basically turn it back over to Judy. I do see some questions in the comments, and I'm happy to address those as part of the question and answer period. If that
okay, great. Thank you, Terry. That was fabulous. Really appreciate the detail that you went into in your presentation. I see, let's see, a hand raised here, Mars. I will ask you to unmute.
Mr. Blevins, thank you for the presentation, first of all. Something that I see going on right now that very, very much concerns me is, like, as you stated, that there's a call to defund and abolish the police, which I think is just incredibly extreme. There have been some other demands that I think are being made for the police to change some of their habits. Like, I've been involved in the martial arts community for a very, very long time. I've come to know many, many members of our law enforcement community, and my experience with them has been like yours. Like, I haven't seen instances of racism. I've seen very honorable individuals work in the field who are concerned about what's now being demanded. And one of which is there's something I saw a few days ago about some kind of demand about they're removing the carotid restraint and the ability for an officer to put weight on an individual to restrain them. And one of the things that concerned me was that removes a tool for gradual escalation of force, and that just seems that'll have some really pernicious effects in the future if it's implemented. With this and the extremity of the demand to abolish the police, what's being done to give this demand a pushback, saying we realize that things need to change, but this is going way too far, you're being unreasonable? What kind of what force of reason is being put back into the public eye to say, like, look, some of this stuff is just not going to work?
It's an excellent question, and you really seem to understand the topics, and your experience in martial arts gives you an insight. I've studied martial arts myself as a police officer, and I can tell you that unfortunately right now the tide is against reason in some ways. I do feel like that it's gone too far. I feel like putting that an officer, and I did it many, many times, being able to use your weight really is sometimes the only tool that you have in order to subdue a person. And whether we like it or not, the reality is that police have to use force during certain situations. And there are a lot of police officers that aren't trained in martial arts, and the defensive tactics training is very limited. A lot of police officers may not have continuing education. Maybe what they received in the academy was the last time that they got any training like that. So the vast majority of police officers are really ill-equipped to have any kind of a physical confrontation with someone, especially someone who is larger, stronger than they are. And it really puts us in a bad position, especially when that officer has a gun, you know, that can be taken from them. So unfortunately, right now, I don't think there's a lot of sanity in that discussion. I do believe that it is up to people like you who, you know, really want to come out and say, can we slow down a little bit and have a reasonable discussion about this so that we try to do something that really works for everyone, that still allows police officers to do their job. Yes, Mars.
How if someone like me was to speak, how could I have an impact? Because a lot of what I see being demanded right here, I from my interactions with police officers, I think some of these reforms will lead to great harm later down the line. But without sanity, if they're not willing to listen to someone who's a part of the institution itself right now, how can I help?
Well, as a citizen, especially in LEAP, we love that because there are people that don't want to listen to what we have to say. They just paint us all with a broad brush and say, you're biased, your opinion doesn't matter. And so it is up to members of the public to come out. And as an individual, you know, nowadays you do have a voice on social media. So, you know, supporting the organization LEAP, volunteering with the organization LEAP to, you know, to be a speaker or to promote, you know, our initiatives, to share them on social media and that sort of thing. We love that. And I can tell you, it's probably the most impact that we have, other than police leadership, such as chiefs and judges. I would say that people in the community who see what we're all about and really help us get the word out, I think that's probably the most effective way that we get our message out. Because, like I said, there are a lot of people that just don't want to hear what law enforcement has to say. Even former, like with me, I think most of you, I hope, would believe that I'm a relatively reasonable person, and I've tried to take a very measured view of this and a very fair view of this. And but there are people that, you know, especially in the reform movement, that just don't want to listen to what I have to say because they say I was brainwashed, I was part of the system, and I don't have the right to even have a voice in this conversation. So that's when we need individuals, members of the public like you, who are willing to, you know, to speak out on these particular issues. So if you don't mind, someone asked about defunding the police. So I'll tell you what our, in general, defunding the police doesn't necessarily mean taking all money. There are some people that believe that. They want the police to be abolished. But there are, most of the time when you talk about defunding the police, it's talking about taking money away from the police and reallocating those funds to other resources, in particular, public health resources. And I can tell you that there are a lot of police officers that believe this is true. There was a few years ago, the Dallas police chief, I think his last name was Brown, he was interviewed. He gave a press conference, actually, and he was talking about the looting. This was after Ferguson, shortly after Ferguson happened, and other cities that broke out in rioting and looting. And he said, and we had been talking about this for a while, but there were a lot of people that, you know, members of the public that spoke to me after this that said, I've never heard it put this way. I've never thought about this. He said, society asks police officers to solve all of its problems. No matter what goes wrong, pick up the phone and dial 911, call the police. They can come out and they can solve all of your problems. And we're asked to be marriage counselors. We're asked to be psychiatrists. We're asked to solve just about every possible problem that can come up, especially problems within a family. We're asked to be drug counselors, and we're just, number one, we're not qualified. Number two, we don't have the resources to deal with those. So you ever hear the phrase, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail? Well, when you're a police officer and sometimes the only tool that you have is to arrest somebody, you end up arresting people that really should not be arrested, because you know, sometimes there are officers that do it maliciously or in a mean way, but there are other times that as an officer, you have to get back out on the road to answer calls. You have other calls that are waiting, people that are wanting your assistance. And so what do you do at that point? Sometimes you just have to arrest the person and put him in jail in order to solve that problem. The husband and wife are fighting, you know, sometimes it may not be the best solution to arrest one of the parties, but at least you put one of the parties in jail so they're not going to be fighting with each other, and you're not going to get called back there because somebody got killed or seriously injured. So defunding the police generally is a movement towards taking public funds and using those funds in other ways to solve problems in a way that doesn't have to do with arrest or with unfortunately escalations of force that could end in serious injury or death to a member of the public. So
great. Terry, there's a question here about your email address. Do you have an email address you're willing to give out?
yes, it's actually at the bottom of that last slide. It is
okay.
terry.blevins@lawenforcementaction.org.
Okay. Then there's a question here about, do you have any thoughts on the militarization of police departments?
Yes, I do believe that there has been an over-militarization of police. Generally, what you find, police officers, you know, especially trainers and leadership in law enforcement, because they believe that they are fair and that they are even-handed, generally police prefer, when they approach a situation or an incident, they, and this is even taught in the academies, we show up with the appearance of overwhelming force, and that way people won't, they will be, especially the bad guys, they'll be intimidated into surrendering, and they won't put up resistance. They won't try to resist arrest. They won't try to commit violence against us. If they see us show up in tactical gear, looking like we could destroy anything that reared its head, that generally people will be intimidated into not committing violence against us. Unfortunately, I believe that is a doctrine that American law enforcement got wrong. I believe that in principle, it seems like a good tactic, and it does seem to work, but unfortunately, it gives the wrong impression. And so having armored vehicles and having guys that wear camouflage that look like military, like they're members of the military, showing up, and you know, these other tactics, it just doesn't look good. And especially when there's still a problem in law enforcement with communities that feel that they're not being protected by the police. The militarization of the police just takes it too far. But again, there has to be, I heard recently that there was a city council that voted to take all of the, and I'm still investigating this, I had it from a police commander. There's in California, there is a city that is taking all of the, in order to demilitarize, they're taking all of the equipment away from their officers, including helmets, shields, and batons, so that when there's a riot, they have zero protection when the police officers go out. And I can tell you something, I haven't had a police commander tell me this directly, but I can tell you that, and this is what we're headed for, folks, so I want you to pay attention and remember what I said today. There is going to be a situation where the police refuse to protect, refuse to go out, either refuse to go out on patrol because the area is too dangerous, because they're not being supported. We will have mass, sort of what they call the blue flu, where police are calling in sick, or police go on strike, or if they're forced to go out to deal with looters, with rioters, violent rioters without protection, they're going to refuse to go. And it's going to be mayhem on the streets. So that's why, Mars, especially what you were saying, I believe there needs to be some sanity in the conversation, because it's going to go in the other direction, and we don't want that. We don't want that either.
Here's another question is, what is your view on the role of police unions in opposing reform or preventing reform?
It's a really good question, and it's an issue that has come up. And I can tell you that in general, again, if you're a hammer and everything looks like a nail, if you're a police union, you protect every police officer, no matter what they've done. If they're a member of that union, no matter what they've done, you will defend them. You'll hire them lawyers, and you'll do everything you can. And police unions have a lot of power, too much power, I believe. Some police unions in particular in larger cities have way too much power. It needs to be revisited. That's one of the reasons that city of Minneapolis, is looking at completely abolishing the police department, because what they would do is they would start from scratch with their any agreements that they had with police unions, and try to get a little bit more sanity into it.
Oh, speaking of other cities, what's your view on the type of reform at places like Camden, New Jersey?
Camden is an amazing example of that. As a matter of fact, right now, LEAP, we are looking for a city that is willing to allow us to come in and use them as an example. We would implement very similar reforms to Camden, and either completely reform the existing police department or abolish the police department and create a new department. And I think if any of you that are listening or watching haven't looked at what Camden has done, it's worth a read. There are a lot of articles on it, and it's really an amazing story. It's not perfect. Like Christina says, change is messy. It's not perfect, but it's a good example of what can be done and what should be done.
Okay, I see Linda Albert had a comment. Could you comment on what's happening on the streets of Portland right now?
So again, I feel like that was a little ridiculous what happened there. It was an overreaction. There shouldn't be any areas that aren't, where the police can't go. I'm not sure that the motives for the people that did that were were promoting the that zone were exactly correct or pure. And of course, we see what ends up happening. So we can't overreact to the concept of police corruption or police bias, misconduct, lack of accountability. We can't overreact to it, because it will not go well for us.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, somebody said, mixing Portland up with Seattle. Portland has a federal police response. Okay. Any other questions does anyone have? I don't see any more questions in the chat.
Judy, this is Sheila Lodge. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm
Thank you.
Hello.
Go ahead.
I have had quite a bit of experience with the police department, having been in city government for a number of years. I've ridden with the police a number of times. My husband was a judge, and he also taught a course in criminal justice at UCSB for many years. One of the things he used to say is that the average police officer in the course of his entire career didn't even pull his gun, let alone fire it at somebody. Is that still true?
Yes, Sheila, that is true.
Okay.
Statistics show that very few police officers, percentage-wise, are ever involved in a shooting.
Okay.
Unfortunately, was not one of those who was able to go their career without being involved in an incident like that. But yes, most are able to make it their entire career.
Most of the police officers are decent people. One of the other things my husband used to say is that many who go into police work have authority issues, and they have a need to dominate people. The first time I rode with the police, it was a full shift. It was either 10 or 12 hours. And when it was over, I concluded that the main qualification for police officers was that they needed to be a psychotherapist. As you know, agreeing with what you said. They're just, there were, and as you say, I also hear this is still true, that the most dangerous call for a police officer to go on is a domestic disturbance, because often the two combative parties turn on the police officer. Is there a way, and my feeling is, I know there is some screening for people who apply to become police officers. Does it need to be improved to make sure that people, I meant to add, one time I rode with a police officer who, he really after a while had me worried because he was so obviously somebody who should not be a police officer. Terrible. Is there a way to screen applicants for becoming police officers in a way where people like that do not get into that profession?
It's a really good question, Sheila. And the reality is that again, we go back to the different police agencies. Most police agencies don't have, especially mid to small agencies that don't have a lot of financial resources, they don't have the money to screen police officers. They don't have a lot of money to do background investigations. And that's another reason we really want there to be a national database of problem officers, so that the smaller agencies can easily access that and use that to help them decide. Large agencies like LAPD, Oakland, San Francisco, Phoenix Police Department, Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office, Santa Barbara Police Department, they have psychological tests, and it involves sometimes over 1,000 questions. It's a personality test. It's called the MMPI. They also have interviews with psychiatrists who ask questions, situational questions, and it's a pretty good method. It's not fail-proof, but it's a pretty good method of determining if a person has problems with aggression. I would say that most police officers, Sheila, do not have problems with aggression, but there are certain numbers of them that get into law enforcement because they want to exercise power over people, and they felt powerless themselves. So this is an opportunity for them to increase their own power, and sometimes it goes horribly awry. It doesn't lead to someone. And trust me, I've worked with police officers. Like I said, most police officers I've worked with were great. I've worked with officers myself that I just shake my head and say, wow, how in the world did you get a badge? This is disturbing and horrifying. And I've seen potentials for problems, and I've actually seen police officers do things that were just horribly disturbing. The problem is that within law enforcement, there's a culture of silence. There really is not any widespread encouragement for police officers to speak out against other police officers.
Yeah, it also seems to me that, like when you said the larger agencies can afford to do screening, the smaller ones can't. 18,000 agencies, perhaps there's a way to do more effective leveraging. If you had fewer agencies, you could leverage more effectively.
Well,
everybody's got to solve the problem themselves. That seems like an impediment.
Either fewer agencies or a better system of centralized control and oversight.
Great. Yes.
I
Well,
see
thank
what you're
you.
saying,
Thank
Mark,
you.
and I understand that. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks, Sheila Lodge was formerly our mayor here in Santa Barbara, so she does know a lot about city government. So Terry, thank you. Hard to applaud, but we'll shake our hands like this to show you our appreciation.